Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the most optimistic climate chat you'll hear this year, at least we hope so, and for a conversation focused on electrification and the need for generational climate action. Over the next hour or so, we're going to hear from Bill McKibben, who just got back from COP26 and the Global Climate Summit in Glasgow, and Saul Griffith, the author of the new book, Electrify. We'll also take some of your questions via the chat function, and I'm tasked with keeping the conversation moving, which will be a lot of fun. But first, some introductions. I'm Ari Matusiak. I'm the CEO of Rewiring America. We're the nation's leading nonprofit dedicated to electrifying everything, without which we won't get to zero emissions ever. We're just about 15 months old as an organization, so we're growing and defining our work still. But we're starting with the nation's 121 million households, which we see as the greatest gap in our national ambition on climate change, or really the greatest opportunity. So we work to provide accurate, accessible, and actionable data, and we're working to do nothing less than start a movement to electrify Americans' lives. There's a reason why I'm wearing a tie, which is not just because of Dr. Griffith and Bill McKibben. It's because we're here in Washington tonight to launch a couple of things. The first is a bicameral electrification caucus that is going to be co-chaired by Senators Heinrich and Smith and Representatives Tonko and Castor to really put forward electrification as a central part of the climate solution and to advance policymaking and education nationally at the policy level on these issues. We're also launching a CEOs for Electrification Coalition with a cross-section of CEOs and companies that represent not just the companies that make the things, but also companies that represent millions of customers around the globe who can help to communicate the need to electrify everything. And the third is a Mayors for Electrification Coalition, which is comprised of a growing number of newly elected and longtime leading mayors across the country who also get that electrification is the answer and what we need to be building toward in the months and years ahead. So now let's get to the speakers. Bill McKibben is the founder of 350.org and thirdact.org, as evidenced by his t-shirt. His 1989 book, The End of Nature, is broadly considered to be the first book on climate change for the global audience. Subsequently, he's published many books and has been published in periodicals such as Rolling Stone to The New Yorker. Foreign Policy named him to their inaugural 100 Most Important Global Thinkers list. Through 350.org, he's established the first global grassroots climate campaign and organized on every continent. Along with thirdact.org, a community of experienced Americans pushing for change that makes the world a better place, he has been at the forefront of the fossil fuel divestment campaign and one of the most crucial players in the climate action movement. Saul Griffith is the co-founder of Rewiring America. He and Alex Lasky teamed up to create our nonprofit to drive a very singular message. And Saul's driving that message right now with a well-reviewed new book, actually well-reviewed by Bill McKibben, called Electrify, an Optimist Playbook for our clean energy future, which is available at rewiringamerica.org. Saul is an engineer and inventor. As founder and chief scientist at Other Lab, an independent R&D lab, he helps government agencies and Fortune 500 companies understand energy infrastructure and deep decarbonization. He's been a principal investigator and project lead on federally funded research projects for agencies including NASA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, Advanced Research Projects Agency, Energy, National Science Foundation, and the United States Special Operations Command. He is a MacArthur Fellow and was awarded that in 2007. He was also hired by the federal government to map our energy sector down to the last solar panel on the supply side and the last leaf blower on the demand side. And that research led to much of how we see the mandate for how we must electrify our lives, and you'll hear a lot about that today. So with that, welcome. First, Saul, I'd like to start with you. Let's assume for a second that everyone on this webinar has not yet read your book. Could you give us the brief on electrifying everything and why it's a strategy for us to take on climate right now? And also just to assure people that we're not going to electrify any cows.
I wrote the book for a very specific audience, policymakers, particularly leading into this administration and into this COP26. And I wrote it also tried to juggle that with writing it for a general audience. And the reason the title Electrify was to try to simplify the sometimes confusing conversation about what does decarbonization, what do global climate solutions really look like. Electrification isn't quite everything. There's still agriculture and emissions from some of our chemical industries, and obviously our cows, aforementioned cows, which we won't electrocute. But electrification in the US is about, close to 90% of our emissions. Energy is close to 90% of our emissions. Globally, it's about 70%. And it really is only through electrification of all of the things we use energy for today that we can get all of those sectors to zero carbon. And so the book goes through the new ways we have to think about that on the supply side. So where is all that energy going to come from? But very much it's trying to personalize the story on the demand side. So the supply side is where big machines exist, power plants, petrol refineries, etc. The demand side is where humans live. That's our homes, our small businesses. It's our cooktops, it's our motorcycles, it's our furnaces, and it's our hot water heaters. And in some excruciating detail, we even go through all of those machines. And the message electrification, including the policy work that we're doing in DC, is really to try and help people understand that if we focus on the demand side, it's an engaging climate conversation that includes people and offers better, healthier, lower cost, cleaner lives. So getting rid of fossil fuels burning in your kitchen improves your child's respiratory health. Electrifying your vehicle and running it with solar or wind will lower the cost of getting around. And so I think there's optimism in being able to put people back in the picture of climate solutions. And then I look forward to discussion with Bill, which is still, the world is struggling with the exact how to do that. But I think we're making progress.
Thank you, Saul. Bill, I'd like to get your perspective just as a jumping off point on Saul's thesis, particularly in light of COP26. Given the stalemates and insufficient ambition that we too often see, is there a political opportunity in this kind of approach in play?
Well, first of all, Saul, such congratulations on the book. It really is wonderful. And it's not most engineers who are also capable of writing a readable and lively book. And this is a really wonderful volume. You don't have to believe me, though I did give it a fine review in the New York Review of Books. I noted that a couple of the other people who recommended it, one was Leah Stokes, who's probably maybe the single wisest voice on national energy policy that we have from UCSB. And the other was Kim Stanley Robinson, whose Ministry for the Future is the best book about climate change, that's best novel yet. Stan and I were wandering around Glasgow, wandering around the park outside the University of Glasgow, watching Greta assemble the youth for a big march on the first Friday of the Glasgow talks. And we were deep in conversation about your book much of the time. And it really is testament to
I elected not to go to Glasgow, but if the author of the Mars trilogy and the End of Nature were both there, I really feel like I missed out.
We were having a very good time. So I mean, clearly this is clearly there's no way to do what we need to do without doing this. I mean, at this point, I think it's, if we had some other set of possibilities 30 years ago or something, I don't know what they were, but at this point, we've run out of other alternative paths, it feels like to me. And that's why the book is so hopeful. I mean, look, it's good that we're having an optimistic talk, because there's plenty to be not optimistic about. Not only did Glasgow not go very well, but back in the real world, I mean, yesterday, British Columbia, which 140 days ago had the highest temperatures recorded in Canada since the Pleistocene, yesterday had the biggest rainstorm in their history, and now the city of Vancouver is cut off from the rest of Canada, I mean, we're in a tough place. But and this is the thing I hope you'll talk about for a minute, because it really interests me. Not quite out of nowhere, but sort of unexpectedly, I think, on the rest of the world, over the last decade, this thing has happened, that the price of renewable energy has dropped so sharply that what once seemed both a necessity and a luxury at the same time now seems like a perfectly feasible, if a heavy lift logistically, but no longer exactly a heavy lift technologically or economically. Really, is that correct? Would you say?
I think that is the underlying hypothesis of the book, and I actually agree with you. It does feel a little bit like magic, and I've been on the front line starting energy companies, trying to do renewable energy since 2004 when I finished grad school, and it has felt like we've been constantly playing catch up with the incumbents. So, everyone was still trying to bet against solar in 2010, or try different versions than just plain old silicon cells in wafers arrayed. Everyone thought they had ideas, but the scale and the cost reductions achieved from that industry have shocked everyone. And at industrial scale, it's under $1 a watt. It's which is 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour delivered electricity. On rooftops in Australia, if factoring in the cost of transmission and distribution, rooftop solar is the cheapest electricity in the world, and that could be true everywhere. Batteries, enormous cost reductions. I think even as late as 2018, I think it was hard to imagine electric cars everywhere, but we're really seeing that does look possible now. The cost of batteries are falling faster than even the cost of solar did. I remember starting a wind energy company in 2007. We thought that it would be good enough to get to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. At the time, wind power was 20 cents a kilowatt hour. That project, we did beautiful work and even launched a prototype off Norway in 2019. But by that point, traditional wind energy had got to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So we were beaten by just the brute sheer scale and industrialization of the fundamentals. And that is a large share of where my optimism is that not quite the free market, but the public-private partnerships, which is governments working with companies to do all of this energy R&D and turn it into reality, has been an astounding success.
Is your sense that that we've got plenty of room left to run on that curve too, right? We haven't bottomed out yet on the price of and on the efficiency of stuff.
Yeah, so the way the world thinks about it, or the boffins who study this, is that for every time you double the production capacity, you decrease by what's called the learning rate. And for solar, that's about 20%. And batteries, it's a little more than 20%. Wind, it's a little bit less. But if you took the rate at which we were making solar panels and batteries and wind power in 2020, and you thought about what we need to be doing in 2030 or 2035 to supply the great majority of the world's energy, we need to not just double the production, but double it again and double it 1 or 2 more times. So at those learning rates, it really does look like the price of all of the fundamental ingredients is going to fall by a half or more in that time, and then truly be a sort of slam dunk economically. I think, and to translate into the conversation, because I've been working very heavily the last 18 months with governments in the US, in Europe, and in Australia, which gives me an interesting perspective. The real challenge is that governments don't really know how to write policy that's anticipating that future when the retail experience of their constituents is still that a Tesla is more expensive than a Toyota. It's still the experience that it's harder to find a contractor to install a heat pump than it is to find a contractor who will install natural gas. So I think that the real challenge is sort of bridging this imagination gap for our politicians, but also for the populace to let everyone know, if we commit, we can, it really is, if we build it, it will come. They will come, the prices will come down. And we're just short of that commitment. But I actually, my optimism is when the market flips. And so, not a terribly liberal organization, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, quite conservative fiscally is projecting that the cost of the electric vehicle in the showroom will be equal in about 2025. That will be a huge watershed moment.
And I just to jump in on that, on some level, Saul, what you are talking about with respect to people's personal infrastructure, which you write about in the book, the machines that they use in their day-to-day lives, and the curves that you're talking about that make the efficient electric machines the no-brainer move for them to take as they replace the machines that fail. There's almost like a heroism to the heat pump installer and installee. But I'm curious how we connect that, how we connect the action that we're seeking to have people take en masse across their homes to the kind of institutional and individual activism that you write about so eloquently, Bill, and have led on for decades. Said another way, how do we take the market moving activity that you all were just discussing into an enlarged base for climate action?
Actually, oh, sorry if I could jump in on this question. I think it's great because Bill is almost I'm going to invite a little bit of a punch up here. Bill, you deserve a lot of credit for starting the sort of various divestment campaigns, which really focused a lot of people's minds on stopping investing in fossil fuels. But most of those divestment campaigns stopped short of the retail consumer. So they very much focused on the producers of oil, the producers of coal. I've always wondered in those divestment campaigns why we don't include Toyota or Ford, because 2% of the world's emissions go through a motor that Toyota made or that Ford made. And my hypothesis is we're a little bit uncomfortable talking about that problem because that's a thing that we own and we therefore are complicit in. But I think the narrative that we're trying to push now is actually that really should be a bit of a relief, because it means now that we have the options on the table, we have heat pumps, we have electric vehicles, we have rooftop solar, that you can engage the general public as being part of the solution. And we redrew the energy and emissions map for the US. And it turns out that about 42% of our emissions are the result of decisions that are made around kitchen tables. So what fuel goes in your cars, what cooks your dinner, what heats your home, what heats your water, where you purchase your electricity from. And that's not to blame the household. I actually, in some respects, I try to mea culpa in the book on behalf of everyone. We lived pretty comfortable lives through the 20th century because we did it the way we did it with fossil fuels. But now we have another option where we can engage every household in the country and every household in the world in the solution in a big and meaningful way. Because if you also include the small businesses whose decisions are also made around those kitchen tables, the amount of the emissions that stem from those decisions is more than half of all of our emissions. So I think there's an interesting.
Yeah, no, to go back to the original question, the reason actually that people have gone so hard after the fossil fuel industry with things like divestment had mostly to do with the hope, so far realized to some extent, of breaking their political power. We just watched the biggest recipient of fossil fuel largesse in Washington, Prime Minister Manchin, got the clean energy pricing plan out of the Build Back Better bill, the single thing that would have gotten us farthest down this road most quickly, I think. And it's a sort of good reminder that that this is not entirely a contest of reason that's playing out here. It's also a contest of vested interest. So I'm glad that we've been able to diminish their social political license to the extent that at least we can be having these kind of conversations in Congress. But we've still got a ways to go, I think. Witnessed the fact, for instance, and this, I don't know if you've noticed this, but it was a remarkable example of what one's up against. In Oklahoma last week, the utility announced that anybody who wanted to cut their gas connection and electrify their home instead would have to pay a $1,300 exit fee to the utility in order to go electrify their homes. So the political battle remains in full force, and we'll have to fight it. But here's a way of,
I personally paid an $800 disconnection fee recently.
there you go.
Unbelievable.
One of the most dynamic climate champions in the political realm, a 34-year-old woman named Michelle Wu, took over as mayor of Boston yesterday. First time in its history, Boston didn't elect a white guy to run its affairs. And Michelle's fantastic, but now she's completely committed. But now she's got the city of 300,000 or 400,000 dwellings there. So if you're the mayor of Boston trying to figure out how you're going to get them all on heat pumps, what's job one? Do you start training people to install them? Do you call in the utility to go to work? Do you just start hectoring your constituents to each one do the right thing? What's the way, given that we have the scientists give us 8 or 10 years to do this task, if we want to catch up with the physics of climate change, what are the, and this is one of the places where I think your discussion of kind of mortgages and things was one of the most interesting parts of the whole book.
And I think your question is perfect. I feel like the book is a success and we're making progress on climate if the question is no longer will we do it with biofuels or carbon sequestration, but the fuel is how do we electrify all of the citizens in Boston in some fair and equitable way on time and to schedule. So I'm going to count a little victory there if we're getting the conversation there. And then I think the questions become very interesting. Maybe my answer won't satisfy you, but I think absolutely you need some regulatory work. In every energy market, regulations now are as much as 50% of the cost of retail energy. So cleaning up the regulations in Boston, let's use Boston as the example, cleaning up the regulations in Boston that probably exist and favor natural gas, because it used to be called town gas in Boston many, many years ago. So for more than a century, we've been writing building codes. We've been writing rules that favor putting in gas easily. Certainly, as it was my experience, I lived in Cambridge, neighboring Boston, and every house I had a natural gas furnace. And whenever it broke, we had to call a contractor who didn't know how to install a heat pump. So clean up the regulatory work. And I think that requires some civic engagement. I think the political movement that's needed in every city and town is the movement of 3 or 4 people who are required or who would meaningfully change council meetings if they showed up to work on building codes. The 3 or 4 people who would meaningfully change rate hearings for the utility regulations, which impact the codes and policies. Then we need workforce training. In fact, today we were advocating on the Hill for focusing our community colleges on workforce training that not only builds capacity, but always also lowers the cost of installation. And to give you an illustration of that, rooftop solar in Australia is less than 1/3 of the price of rooftop solar in the US. And it, even despite the fact that Australia has a higher prevailing wage and it's $35 an hour for the installers of that solar. What they did that was very, very clever, which I think they did accidentally, is they ran a certification and training program to train the installer to not only be the installer, but to be the inspector. It moved the liability for anything that's going wrong to the certification agency, which made sure the certification agency did a spectacular job training the workforce. And that was largely responsible for why it's so much cheaper there. So I would advocate that we need to do that for rooftop solar. We need to do that for vehicle charging infrastructure. Getting 250 million vehicles charged is a lot of jobs installing a lot of vehicle charging network. We absolutely need to do that for HVAC, which broadly means heat pumps for water and space heat. And we need that, we probably are short 1 million electricians in the country's workforce if we're to do this by 2035 on the timeframe required to meet our climate goals. So after the regulatory work, I'd start the training programs. I'd engage the high schools and the community colleges in that. And then I would look at every single possible way to buy down the upfront cost and develop the market. So that means for low-income houses, rebates that make sure that these things are. The reality is today, if your water heat, 40% of people who go out to buy a water heater are buying it under financial duress. Probably their partner is pregnant or ill. It's either the middle of winter or the middle of summer. You need it tomorrow. You buy the cheapest natural gas machine that you can buy, and it's installed tomorrow, and it's the least efficient and most. So I think we then need to design all sorts of stimulus and rebate programs so that when that person is making that decision at that point of purchase, we have made the electric heat pump the cheapest option. That will probably need to be true for about 5 more years to get the training up and the costs down. So there is a little bit of moment here for the market to be stimulated with those types of rebates. And then I'd look further to the idea of the mortgage that's mentioned in the book. You really can now model out that if you can afford the slightly increased cost of the solar, of the heat pumps, of the electric vehicles, the operational cost over the lifetime saves, in 2021, more than half, as much as 80% of every household in the US would be saving money. But by 2025, it's a slam dunk. We invented a thing to solve this problem of things that are expensive up front but cheaper later. And we invented auto finance in 1920s in the US, and we invented housing finance in 1935, the creation of Fannie Mae in the US. And I think those two, I hate to say this as an engineer and a scientist and as a technologist, but I think those two creations of those financing products had a bigger influence on what the 20th century looked like than all of the technology that we developed, because it made these things affordable for everyone everywhere. So I think we need to look at also creating those financial instruments. Just a last word on that. I've had the great fortune of living in Australia for the last 9 months because of the pandemic. And it's a great fortune because in some respects, it's a peek into the future. Because of that really cheap solar on the roofs, Australians are now demanding electric vehicles. They're demanding electric heat. And in fact, 2 separate banks, one of them Macquarie Bank, one of them Commonwealth Bank. One of them was kind enough to say, we've been listening to your podcasts and your ideas about financing, and we've created 5 banking products to finance these items in these household upgrades, and we're going to help people finance them against their home loans or their car loans, whichever is relevant. And so I'm seeing in Australia that these things are coming into existence. Now there's the demand, and now that the prices in the market are getting there. So that's a long list of recommendations for what the mayor. So the first thing the mayor needs to do is all of the above in Boston to get us there. That's because of the urgency that I think you and I both share.
So one thing I would just jump in on, and then Bill, I want to ask you another question here, and sort of like flip it back to you on the question that you just asked. One thing that we have been hearing from mayors as we've been going out and talking to them about this Mayors for Electrification Coalition, and frankly talking to them about climate action, is the same thing we've been hearing from political leaders generally, which is how do we connect the dots between what we need to do on climate, the imperative for action, with people's real life experience. And so one of the things that I am very excited about personally with respect to that is that mayors can grab hold of the issue, because it's about returning dollars to their constituents in a very local way. It's sort of like the climate version of potholes, which is not bad politically. And I'm wondering, Bill, from your perspective, as you kind of think about it, what's the toolbox for the incoming mayor in Boston? How would you answer that question? What's your perspective on that as she takes office and sets an example as a climate leader across the country?
Well, I mean, I think actually we're sort of at an interesting point, at least in some places, like say Boston, where some of the work of activists and advocates we've done the most important work we can do, which is to get people to this stage. And now there's an extraordinary amount of execution to be done. And that's a different set of tasks. Yeah. And that's really what, in some places anyway, this decade is going to be about. And I think that the kind of networks of activists and advocates are going to be important. because there's going to be, there are going to be fights all along the way here, in every way. One of the fights that's already popping up around America is people's unwillingness to cite renewable energy in lots of places, and especially in the Northeast. But that's that's going to be one of these ongoing questions. And I think the reason that Saul's book is so important, and some of this other work in the last year or so is so important, the work of Mark Jacobson at Stanford, laying out energy plans for one country after another on renewable energy, this remarkable new study from Oxford demonstrating that a fast transition to renewables saves trillions of dollars net, even before you factor in the avoided cost of destroying the planet, on and on. I think that it sets us up for this kind of large scale sea change in attitude now. And so I think that's truly important. I'm curious from Saul of a couple of things. There's a couple of technical things I wish he would talk about, because I think these are things that continue to worry people a lot and or cause them a certain amount of confusion. One is, talk for a little bit, and the work in the book on this is very interesting. Talk for just a minute about the relative usefulness of sun and wind versus nuclear power, because that's the other way we could low carbon electrify things. And then talk about the challenge that's emerging, I think, around it's clear that the conversion to electrifying things would in the end mean we're doing a lot less mining in the world, but we're going to have to do a lot to get there, and it's going to be of stuff we don't really have enough of right now. And there are big human rights and environmental challenges around that, some of that work around lithium and cobalt and whatever else. And those are things too we need to be thinking about, because they could politically derail some of this momentum even as it gets going.
They're both great topics. So let's talk about nuclear first. I'm sort of a neutral party on nuclear. You can say with an honest face that nuclear has, in some net lives impacted per megawatt hours of energy delivered. It's really one of the safest forms of energy we've had over the last few centuries. But we have over the last 50 years. But we have had a couple of spectacular accidents that could have been worse, and so the human imagination imagines far worse. But all in all, it statistically is very safe. The real challenge, so I don't have an objection. There's quite a lot of uranium. There's probably 1,000 years supply of the fissile materials that if humans went that way. Sorry, I just saw Bill freeze and I'm wondering, I hope I haven't frozen. So there's plenty of it. The reality is that we still don't have a solution for where we put the waste, particularly in the US. And in fact, most of the nuclear waste from power plants is still stored on site, basically in glorified swimming pools, because we haven't been able to find a politically palatable place to bury it deeply in the ground or otherwise process it. So there's still a concern about the wastes. There's still a concern about security. What's not recognized is that nuclear is one of the technologies that we use, a thermoelectric cycle to turn into electricity. That means that you boil water with it, use that water to spin a turbine that runs a generator that provides electricity to the grid. Most people won't know that about 41% of all fresh water in the US currently goes through one of these thermoelectric power plants, be it coal, natural gas, or nuclear. Let's say that already we have water table stresses everywhere. So that's we're approaching the limit of water that we can push through these plants, because you warm it up and you can't warm up the creek on the other side too much without killing the fish and the frogs. So if 41% of our water is the limit, nuclear could only supply about a quarter of the electricity if we electrified all of the end users. So It might not even scale as well as people think. Now, there are people working on ways to cool it without using water. There are people working on next generation reactors. But remember, the emissions that count the most to cut right now are the ones you can count soonest. In the US, we've only approved one reactor in the last 40 years now. So it took 40 years to get through. So what I would say is I'm tepidly in favor of increasing a little bit the amount of nuclear in the US. I don't think politically you'll ever stop America having nuclear power if it wants to also have a nuclear military capacity. So we may as well manage it wisely and use enough of it to make the rest of the challenge that we have ahead of us easier. If we were producing 10 or 20% of the electricity for the US through nuclear, then it drastically lowers the amount of batteries. It makes getting through our winter lulls much, much easier. So I think the sensible path is to at least keep the reactors we have and maybe build as many again in the next few decades. I have doubts that will be politically possible for exactly the reason you mentioned. There's the not in my backyard syndrome in the US very strongly. Looking around the world, you can say that there are blessed countries that can do this transition without any nuclear at all. Australia, Canada, the US, Russia, countries with very large land masses, low population densities relative, can do it. Certainly, it's hard to imagine Southeast Asia solving this problem without using some nuclear. So I think pragmatically, you also need to be in the business of it because it will be used globally. But I do think that there are nuclear advocates that want it to be all of the solution. That's not going to happen. It's not going to be the cheapest energy source. Even if nuclear energy could provide electricity for free onto the US grid, it would be more expensive than rooftop solar is on a rooftop in Australia. So the answer is there's going to be a blend. You should probably temper your enthusiasm for nuclear on the water limitations front and on the political reality of getting enough of it installed in the next 20 years to really make an impactful difference. So maybe I'll give you an opportunity to rebut those, or maybe you had something else you wanted me to say about nuclear.
No, that's fascinating. And I think the cost thing is dispositive in a lot of ways. But I was interested also in that question around minerals and supply and getting ahead of the question of the human rights and environmental challenges around them.
Yeah, so I think this is an issue we absolutely should be wary of. I've personally visited Kenya and been very close to where we are killing gorillas for mining some of the rare earths in the world because it's been used for bushmeat for underpaid miners in those regions. I think it is a truism that we actually do have the technology now to address climate change, but we could still choke the oceans in plastics, and we could still lose, our closest genetic relatives, the great apes, this century. So I think that's the reason why we actually have to care. I'm going to give you a little bit of the optimistic version, and that's to compare this challenge to standard practice. So the average American today, about 6 tons, 6,000 kilograms of fossil fuels is burned every year for every American. That just goes up into the atmosphere. None of it is recycled. If you do very cursory math on what it would take to supply an American with their whole lifestyle, same size car but electric, same size house but electric heat, et cetera, and we were going to do that 50% with solar energy, 50% with wind energy, and because it's solar and wind, we're going to store 50% of it in batteries. It turns out you'd only need about 50 kilograms of wind turbines, 50 kilograms of solar, and 50 kilograms of batteries for each person each year. And as my original degree was in metallurgy, and as a metallurgist, it turns out that most of the components of most of those things are very highly recyclable metals. And we should, as with the two most recycled materials in the world are steel and aluminum, and if we are clever and we build these systems around circular economy, we should be able to recycle 80% or more of all of those metals. And so that 50 kilograms per person per year goes down to 10-ish kilograms per person per year. So if you compare the 6,000 kilograms of stuff that we push through ecosystems all around the world right now, and you compare that to 30, I think there's a lot of room for optimism. But we need to be cautious. There were concerns that there wasn't going to be enough lithium. I think most scientists are now satisfied there's enough lithium. My concern is more about things like cobalt and the rare earths, which we should be more cautious about. And we are certainly going to need a lot more copper. And of all of the mining practices in the world, copper is one of the more destructive. So I think I think you need to have a very pragmatic approach to this question, which is, well, we don't really have another option for decarbonizing if we would like to have something like Western civilization. So we need to electrify, but we should be cautious about how we do the mining, and we should make sure we do the recycling. And then just as one bright light on that recycling front, J.B. Straubel, who was a very early, I think he was employee 5 at Tesla, is now running a very successful lithium battery recycling operation in Nevada that's scaling up very quickly. So I think we do have some of our best and brightest focused on this issue, which is good news.
Indeed.
So I want to pivot the conversation a bit, ask one more question, and then make sure we've got some time to take questions from folks who are dropping them in the Q&A. If you're dropping them in the chat, drop them in the Q&A, please, so we can pick them up. We referenced a few minutes ago the conversations in Washington around Build Back Better, which is we've had the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure framework signed into law just the other day by President Biden. Still not done is the climate, the major climate spending and social spending plan in Build Back Better. So we had a little bit of a dialogue just a few minutes ago about how the market trends are at play and driving down the cost curves and enabling these technologies to be affordable. But Rewiring America has been very involved in Build Back Better and pushing for rebates and incentives that will lower the cost of these efficient electric machines and help put money in the pockets of American families in order to address climate change. And we're not there yet. And so I would love to hear from both of you your perspective on why Build Back Better is important to addressing the current climate crisis, not just from a U.S. climate performance perspective, but also from a U.S. global leadership perspective. And Bill, I'd love for you to take that.
Sure. Look, I mean, all you had to do was be in Glasgow to sense the answer to that. The Glasgow meeting but came up very short, mostly because Joe Biden arrived with nothing. The plan was that Joe Biden was going to arrive with the Build Back Better bill in his back pocket and plunk it down on the table and challenge everybody else to, pony up to, and here we go. But, with the remarkable return on their investment that the fossil fuel industry gets for funding Joe Manchin, he gutted important parts of the bill and then delayed its passage to the point where Biden, showed up naked. And everybody in the world, who cared about this was watching and knew precisely what was going on. The US is the biggest historical emitter of carbon by a large margin. If we're not, able or willing to play a role, then, frankly, I'm not the most astute political analyst in the entire world, but it seems to me that the chances for big legislative action after the Build Back Better bill are very slim. It took us more than a decade to get from the last congressional attempt to do something about climate change to now, and the last one failed in 2009. So, this is the ultimate test for everyone to figure out how to get as good a bill passed as possible in the next few weeks. And it's, quite knuckle time in a lot of ways, but this is the opportunity.
Saul, you want to jump in on that and talk about ambition level too?
At the risk of countermanding my editor's insistence on putting optimism in the title, I think we should have a frank conversation about this. I think one of my best days in 2020 was when the Biden administration said 50% reductions by 2030. That was the first science-based target announced by a major emitting nation in history. That was amazing. But that was an aspirational goal. And it's a little hard to do the accounting because the dust hasn't settled, but let's be very crudely honest. We've maybe addressed 5 to 10% of emissions in what will be the fully packed Build Back Better Plus infrastructure deal. So that's a long way short of the target. I certainly wrote the book, and in fact, it's almost jingoistic at times about America, because using the American war, World War II, America really came to the world's rescue with decisive policy, and then in a huge private-public partnership, which was the US government asking American industry to make things to win that war. And I think what everyone's memory of the best of America is the great America, even in Donald Trump's, what we would like to return to was that post-war America that was built on this incredible World War II manufacturing effort. And then there was manufacturing surplus, so they could build all of the things for the whole world through the 50s and 60s on the back of the Marshall Plan. And that was an astounding moment. And I think when I was writing the book, it's a long time between when you put the pen down and when the book gets published. It's more than 18 months. My worldview or theory of change was that you really needed the American government to go big here, to get the world to go along with it. And sadly, Bill is right. Biden showed up naked. I'm not sure how to turn that to optimistic, but I will try the following. I've been, again, to return to Australia where the future is happening, we are politically, the peers of Australia at the climate negotiations are Saudi Arabia and Russia. We're a petrostate disguised as a first world nation. And the politics are all about coal. And the politics were all about coal going into COP. And in fact, the Australian position was worse than pretty much everyone's at this COP, as it has been at all the previous ones. So you would think they're a terrible country on this issue, but behind the scenes, at state level, the Australian states have the most ambitious climate targets in the world. If you took the collection of the best piece of policy from the 7 Australian states, you have fully decarbonized nation by 2035. It's very much in conflict with the federal government, but even the federal government is coming around. Now they've scraped through and satisfied their fossil lobbying interests into COP. They're facing an electorate 70 to 80% because of the fires in 2019, 2020, are demanding change on climate change. And because they've experienced very cheap solar, they're demanding, they know what the solution is. It's cheap solar, it's electrifying their lives. And maybe my new theory of the next biggest leverage point is to get Australia to prove to the world, here's what it looks like. And you can see cities and towns now vying to be electrified and zero carbon first. And I actually think it's that city to city work now, and it's mayors and it's local councils, and it's I actually really do subscribe that it's going to be the race to the top. Just as we were hoping for the world's ambition to be raised by Joe Biden, I'm hoping that every mayor's ambition is raised by the woos of this world as they decarbonize their cities. I think that is where the best hope for rapid climate action is now. It's in the city that can first stand on the global stage and say, you know what, despite of our cold weather, or despite of the fact that we're a rainy city, or whatever it is, because everyone's slightly handicapped in one front, we managed to do it first, and then that will beget more ambition everywhere else. I think, and because we need a plethora of solutions, I think the cities are natural testing grounds for all of the, the local generic architecture differences and how that plays out. And so I'm excited now to, precisely because I think mechanisms like COP are not working, we need to think in that more local, more city, more state-based way. Although I'd be interested in Bill's opinion. Just one last thought. I'm also interested in Bill's opinion. I think COP, I was reflecting on the failure of COP. It's designed, the mechanism is designed for countries to get to zero carbon within their own national boundaries, which necessitates a nationalist look at their energy systems. And for most countries, it's very difficult to solve climate change within your own geographic boundaries. And so they lean back on nationalist policies that look like fossil fuels. And I wonder how that interacts.
Yes, and the other problem with that is that it does, I mean, we're talking entirely about the demand problem here, but there's a supply problem too, exemplified by Australia, which, even if it got its own act in order, delights in shipping cheap coal to the rest of the world. And the same in the US, where today Joe Biden approved 80 million acres of oil leasing in the Gulf of Mexico, So yes, this is an ongoing set of problems. And we're in danger of becoming less optimistic than we promised here. But I think it's kind of a reminder of the fact that we really do have this one path forward. So we better figure out how to make it happen at every possible level. And I'll just say, I think realistically, we better figure out some ways to have it happen at the more than municipal level if we're going to get it done in the time that we're talking about here.
You would like, yes, I think the bigger geographic region that can say we did it and prove to the world that it's possible, that is absolutely critical. Norway might get there just by the luck of having France and Denmark in proximity. But you'd like something that's a little harder case than Norway to be the proof point.
Were we all Norwegians, the world would work just fine. That's it. Yes.
There you go.
Well, I guess the part of the optimism could be Norway, but part of the optimism could also just be the clarity of the path, right? You said earlier, Bill.
That's right.
Really,
and that's why this. Let me just say that. I mean, among other things, we should remind people to go buy this book because it is a really good book. I mean,
at rewiringamerica.org.
Quite straightforwardly.
Well, thank you for that.
Yes, we amen to that. I think I wanted to, Bill, I want to have carve time for two questions that have come in. There have been so many, and we will. Some folks have asked whether we're going to preserve this discussion, and the answer to that is yes. And we will share it back so that folks can have a record of it and watch it at their leisure. But I think, Bill, you said a minute ago that we got to do more than just have it happen at the local level, which makes a ton of sense and is obviously critical. I actually want to go in two directions with that. One is to sort of take the thread from the beginning of the conversation about political action and sort of execution, to talk about what is the next step for the movement, broadly speaking, in your from your perspective, Bill. And then after you have a chance to answer that, Saul, I'm going to tee up a softball question for you that you will love about schools.
Okay, I'll just say quickly, I think a lot of the attention of movements is going to be turning towards financial institutions, banks, asset managers, insurance companies. At the moment, they're the money pipeline to the fossil fuel industry. A bank like Chase has lent the fossil fuel industry $1/3 of $1 trillion since Paris. They didn't need Donald Trump to sabotage it. They were willing to do it themselves, But they also could hold a lot of the key in terms of precisely what Saul was talking about earlier. I mean, the development of financial products that allow people, cities, businesses, everybody else to rapidly transform their infrastructure is crucial here. And there's probably no substitute, for better or for worse, in the short term for that role that financial institutions are going to play here. So one of the things I think that's happening in Washington right now that's really important is a lot of pressure on the Fed, the Treasury, others to try and move the financial sector, and activists the same way. My last trip before lockdown was getting arrested in Washington, not outside the White House, but in the lobby of the Chase Bank nearest the Capitol. And you know, it's going to take a lot of pressure like that to turn these guys from villains into supporters.
Thank you for that, Bill. Saul, I want to go from the zoomed out view to the local view. Juanita Hendricks asked this question that just seemed too perfect not to share. My well-meaning county sees that its 200 schools are a huge energy emissions source. They want to, quote, do something, so have a plan to, quote, green some existing schools and plan for future schools to have more green features. But a large part of the county's plan for schools is to go from having 10% of our county school energy costs paid with RECs to moving it to 50%. Everything I've read suggests this is foolhardy. Any words of advice as to how to let county schools know going with RECs may be not the best strategy to get your emissions to zero? Thank you. And I'll add, and therefore what can be done?
Juanita, thank you for your question. I have a friend, Sam Kalish. He was among two friends who helped me write the book, which I'm going to shamelessly plug there. Laura Fraser was the other. She's lurking, asking the hard questions in the chat, I see. Sam is extremely passionate about electrifying the nation's 100,000 schools. And in fact, he and I both received a fabulous email from a high school student in California who said he would like to put a megawatt of solar on every high school in the US. And he had done his calculations and showed that you would actually supply a significant portion of US energy supply if you did so. And he even pointed at a school in New Mexico, I've forgotten the name of it right now, that has a 1.5 megawatt solar array and a huge megawatt hour battery. That electricity will be much, much cheaper than RECs for those schools. Because the schools' loads are somewhat light. Most schools will be able to produce excess electricity and actually feed it into their communities. And we were actually discussing again on the Hill today the other benefits. You know, we could be charging at very low cost the vehicles for all of the nation's all of the teachers in the nation. And the nice thing about school buses is they drive a little bit in the morning and a little bit in the afternoon, but they need huge batteries, so we can actually use them as a demand response resource. And in fact, there's a company called Proterra in California that's already down this pathway. I think a national program, maybe I wish we knew how to name it right now on the air tonight, but I think a national program that's building capacity by training the future renewable energy advocates of the nation by putting solar on 100,000 schools and using the local community college, hopefully training program, so that we're building capacity to put solar and batteries in throughout the rest of the buildings in the nation. That's the scale of thinking we need to think about. And the answer is that will be the cheapest way for those schools to electrify. But to Bill's point, we'll need some nice banks to come to the party, but what bank won't want to, after the last couple of years that we've had, won't want to help finance with low-cost financing the nation's schools to build the future we need? I think we should be able to find win-win-win-win-wins here. There's my optimism, shamelessly coming up to the top.
I love the shameless optimism, and why don't we end with each of you giving your optimistic the one thing that people should do to sort of practice the optimism of the climate imperative that we have. And Bill, as you do that, if you could share a little bit about Third Act, I think.
Oh, sure. Well, actually, that goes to the question. I mean, I think one of the things that's been clear here is, as we discuss this, that despite the fact that this is the obvious rational solution going forward, that doesn't mean that it's going to happen by itself. And you know, the important fights in our world are never about reason and evidence. They're always about money and power. And we're going to have to win that battle before we can win the other one. So organizing remains important. If there are clearly young people are doing a great job of organizing now around climate and energy. We need older people, which is why we've started this group Third Act for people over the age of 60. We have, among other things, 70% of America's financial assets compared with 5% for millennials. That's not particularly fair, but it's reality. And so if we're going to put pressure on these crucial institutions, we're going to need a few of us with hairlines like mine taking part. And so I hope that, tell your parents, your grandparents, get them engaged.
So when I started Rewiring America with Alex Lasky, who hopefully is listening, or I'll see him later tonight, we violently agree with you, Bill. We said we don't need more Gretas. We need an AARP for climate. So AARP is the American Association of Retired People. It's, it is, the joke in Washington is that it has its own zip code. It has its hands in every piece of legislation. It makes the NRA look trifling in terms of its organizational capacity. And I'm really passionate about the how of, and I don't know that we know how to do it. You're obviously already working on it, but how do we create the centrist, sensible climate movement that can embrace, honestly, people who are overtaxed? I think about 2 income households with 2 working parents and a couple of kids and a bunch of commuting. And you got to think about, how do they succeed in this climate journey we all have to go on, and how do they engage with activism where they can't quite afford to tie themselves to a fence anymore? So I think there's this incredible opportunity in the US, around the world, to create a new kind of advocacy in the middle that is, literally fighting for our children. And I think imagining the various ways we can get to build that AARP for climate that's exciting to me.
Well, thank you both. I would say it was an honor to share the room with you, but it's a Zoom room, so I guess it's an honor to share the screen with you. Really deeply appreciate the engaging conversation, the honesty, the urgency, and, Saul, the optimism too. As I said, we will make this conversation available on rewiringamerica.org. We hope folks take the time to check out Third Act and everything that Bill is doing. Take some time to come to rewiringamerica.org and see some of the data and the reports and the policies that we are pushing for in conjunction with the blueprint that Saul has laid out. Take a chance at reading Saul's book, which you can get through rewiringamerica.org, which is just a way for you to stay in touch with us. And let's all do our part to ratchet the ambition so that we can all maintain the optimism about executing in the decade ahead. So thank you all. Have a great evening. Saul, I'll see you soon.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Ari.
Take care, y'all. Good work.
Bye.